That service animal is unauthorized on HOA property and is being confiscated immediately. Those were the exact words my blind son heard as his guide dog was ripped away and caged right on our doorstep. I'm Robert Wilson, 55, and what our power-abusing HOA president never suspected was that every illegal action she took against my disabled child was being documented by federal agents. What happens when homeowners associations cross the line from enforcing rules to violating federal law? 15 years ago, I purchased our home in Oak Ridge Estates, a decision based on the neighborhood's safety ratings, quality schools, and what appeared to be a welcoming community for my family. The manicured lawns and community amenities seemed worth the HOA fees, which were reasonable compared to similar neighborhoods in our area. My wife Lisa and I had researched dozens of communities before choosing Oak Ridge, believing it represented the perfect place to raise our son. We were initially charmed by the community's apparent commitment to family values. The previous HOA board had been led by a retired school principal who organized neighborhood events and fostered a sense of belonging. Monthly barbecues, summer pool parties, and holiday decorating contests brought neighbors together. For the first decade, Oak Ridge truly felt like the home we'd always wanted. Then everything changed, first in our family life, then in our community. My son Michael, now 16, lost his sight 4 years ago after complications from what should have been routine surgery to correct a minor vision problem. The procedure went catastrophically wrong when the surgeon made a critical error, severing the optic nerve. The medical malpractice case dragged on for 2 years, and while the settlement provided financial compensation, nothing could restore my son's vision or the confidence he lost in those dark months following his blindness. The day Michael came home from his final hospital stay, our neighborhood rallied around us. Meals appeared on our doorstep. Neighbors offered rides to medical appointments. The community that had welcomed us seemed determined to help us through this tragedy. We believed, despite everything, that we were in the right place for Michael's recovery. Then Lisa was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer. The next 18 months became a blur of surgeries, chemotherapy, and desperate hope. Michael, already struggling with his blindness, now faced the prospect of losing his mother. I took family leave from my position as an engineering project manager to care for them both. Our savings dwindled as medical bills mounted despite insurance. When Lisa passed away 2 years ago, something broke in Michael that his blindness hadn't touched. Depression consumed him. His grades plummeted from straight A's to barely passing. He withdrew from friends and activities. Some days, he refused to leave his room, saying there was no point in getting up when everything was dark anyway. The psychologist we consulted recommended a service animal, specifically a guide dog trained to help Michael navigate his new reality. The waiting list was over a year long, but a cancellation moved us up, and after 6 weeks of intensive training together at a specialized facility in Colorado, Buddy, a golden retriever specifically matched to Michael's gait, height, and personality, came home with us last year. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Michael's independence returned almost overnight. His therapist noted remarkable improvements in his emotional state. He began learning Braille more effectively, rejoined the school swim team, where he'd once been a promising competitor, and even started taking independent walks through our neighborhood with Buddy confidently guiding him. For the first time since losing both his sight and his mother, Michael spoke about the future, about college possibilities, career interests, even dating. Buddy became more than a guide dog. He restored my son's will to live. Every morning, I watched from the window as Michael and Buddy completed their route to the community mailbox, a small journey that represented monumental progress. During this period of recovery, significant changes were happening in our community governance. The long-serving HOA board president retired and moved to Arizona. Several other board members stepped down simultaneously, creating an unusual power vacuum. A special election was held, but with minimal participation, less than 20% of homeowners voted. That negligible turnout allowed Deborah Klein, 62, a retired corporate attorney who had moved to the community just 2 years earlier, to secure the presidency with only 46 votes. I hadn't attended the election meeting, as it coincided with one of Michael's medical appointments. Like many neighbors, I didn't realize how significantly our community's character would change under new leadership. Within months, violation notices began appearing throughout the neighborhood for infractions that had never previously been enforced: decorative flags, unapproved plant varieties, garage doors left open more than 30 minutes. The community newsletter, once filled with event announcements and neighbor spotlights, now featured stern reminders about bylaw compliance and threats of escalating fines. That newfound independence Michael had gained through his partnership with Buddy became the target of our newly elected HOA president, who viewed our community bylaws not as guidelines for harmonious living, but as weapons to wield against anyone she deemed undesirable. Her campaign against my son's service animal would ultimately reveal a pattern of systematic discrimination that federal authorities have been quietly investigating for months. The trouble began innocuously enough. Last September, a printed notice appeared on our door. Reminder: all animals must be registered with the HOA office. $25 registration fee applies. Noncompliance will result in fines. Though I knew federal law exempted service animals from such fees, I decided to comply to maintain good relations. I visited the HOA office the next day with Buddy's service animal certification, ADA documentation, and a check for the registration fee. The small HOA office was located in our community clubhouse, a space that had once been welcoming but now felt oddly sterile. The cheerful bulletin board featuring community events had been replaced with a large sign listing finable violations. Where children's artwork once decorated the walls, there now hung framed copies of the community bylaws and architectural guidelines. The office manager, Brenda, who had worked there for over a decade, seemed uncomfortable as she reviewed the paperwork. She glanced nervously at the closed door to the inner office before leaning forward. "I should mention," she whispered, "Ms. Klein has been particular about animal documentation recently. Make sure you keep copies of everything." Her eyes darted toward the security camera newly installed above the reception desk. "And you didn't hear this from me." As I was leaving, the inner office door opened, and Deborah Klein emerged. Though we'd never formally met, I recognized her from community emails, a tall, impeccably dressed woman with steel gray hair cut in an expensive bob. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she noticed Buddy's service vest. "New dog in the community?" she asked, her tone pleasant, but her smile not reaching her eyes. "This is Buddy, my son's guide dog," I explained. "I've just registered him with Brenda." "Ow." "Nice," she replied, studying Buddy with a look that suggested he was tracking mud on her carpet. "We'll be in touch if there are any issues." Her warning made sense a week later when I found a red violation notice taped to our mailbox. Fine, $150, unregistered animal on premises. I immediately called the HOA office. Deborah herself answered. "There must be a mistake," I explained. "I registered with Buddy last week. I have the receipt right here." "Service animals aren't exempt from our regulations, Mr. Wilson," she replied coldly. "The board voted on additional certification requirements last week. Your dog doesn't meet our new standards." I took a deep breath, reminding myself to remain calm. What additional requirements? We weren't notified of any changes. "The updates were posted on the community website and sent via email," she countered, though I had received no such notification. "We now require service animals to have a special certification from our approved veterinarian, who will determine if the animal truly meets our community standards. It's a simple process, just $350 for the examination and certification fee." "That's a direct violation of federal law," I countered. "The Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act explicitly prohibit charging fees for service animals or creating barriers to reasonable accommodations. My son is legally blind. Buddy is necessary for his independence and mobility. Many people claim disabilities these days," she replied dismissively. "We have our own legal counsel. Thank you. Our community has special exemptions based on our status as a private property association. Pay the fine or face further penalties." The conversation left me stunned. Despite having lived in HOA communities before, I'd never encountered such blatant disregard for federal protections. I spent that evening researching disability housing laws, confirming what I already knew: Deborah's special exemptions were entirely fictional. I drafted a detailed email to the entire HOA board, citing the specific federal guidelines and legal precedents protecting service animals. I attached digital copies of all buddy certifications, training documentation, our registration receipt, and links to Department of Justice guidelines stating explicitly that HOAs cannot charge additional fees or create special certification requirements for service animals. The next day passed with no response. Then another. By the third day, I began to wonder if my email had somehow been blocked. I was about to send a follow-up when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. It was Jim Takahashi, a board member I knew from community pool events before Lisa's illness. Rather than replying to the email, he had called me directly from his personal phone. "Robert, I got your email," he said in a hushed tone. "I'm calling from my office downtown, not from home. This conversation needs to stay between us." His caution surprised me. "What's going on, Jim?" "Deborah is out of control, but she's somehow convinced most of the board to follow her lead. They're afraid of her. She's threatened legal action against anyone who opposes her, claiming they're violating their fiduciary duty to the community." "But the policies she's implementing are clearly illegal," I protested. "I know that, and I suspect she does too. But she's persuasive, keeps talking about community standards, and has dangerous connections. Document everything. Save every notice. Record every interaction if you legally can. You're not the only homeowner she's targeting." When I asked what he meant, Jim hesitated. "Let's just say several residents with special needs have found themselves facing unusual scrutiny lately. The Parkers, the elderly couple on Magnolia Drive, they requested permission to install a wheelchair ramp last month. Denied. The Chavez family's autistic son, they were fined because his therapy equipment is visible from a street. Be careful. Deborah essentially controls part of our local police through her brother-in-law, Sergeant Klein. She's been using police officers to enforce her personal HOA agenda. They show up in uniform, making it look official. I've seen them harassing other residents with disabilities. That night, I installed security cameras covering our front door, driveway, and the street in front of our home, a precaution that would later prove critical. I also set up automatic cloud backup of all footage and enabled motion-activated recording and notifications to my phone. While installing the front door camera, I noticed our next-door neighbor, Harold Peterson, watching from his porch. Harold was a retired postal worker who had always been friendly, often bringing our Ms. Delivered mail over personally rather than returning it to the post office. "Security system?" he called over. I nodded, just being cautious. He walked over, glancing around before speaking. "Smart move. Things aren't what they used to be around here." He lowered his voice. "Between us, I've been on the receiving end of Deborah's special attention too. My nephew, who uses a wheelchair, visited for a weekend last month. 2 days later, I got a violation notice for unauthorized structures because we used a temporary ramp over the front steps." Harold's revelation confirmed Jim's warning. There was a pattern developing, and it seemed focused specifically on residents with disabilities or those associated with them. Over the next month, the harassment escalated with strategic precision. The $300 fine notice arrived the same day. I received citations for garbage cans left out, suspiciously always on Michael's therapy days. Then came fabricated landscape violations for non-existent plants, each requiring my personal appearance during business hours. With every forced day off work, I watched our savings dwindle while Deborah's trap tightened. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't random enforcement. It was targeted psychological warfare. Then Michael came home from school, visibly shaken. The special education transportation had dropped him at our community entrance as usual, where he and Buddy would walk the 3 blocks to our home, an important independence exercise his mobility instructor had established. "Dad," he said, his voice trembling, someone official sounding, stopped us at the gate. They said Buddy wasn't allowed on common property without a special yellow tag that costs $200. When I explained he's my guide dog, they took pictures and said they'd be filing a report for aggressive animal behavior. Aggressive behavior? I was stunned. What happened? Nothing. Buddy just stood there in harness like he's trained to do. Michael's hands shook as he removed his coat. They said I needed to call for an escort home or remove the dog from the property. A neighbor heard the commotion and walked us home. That neighbor, Eleanor Patel, called me that evening. She wasn't just any neighbor. She was a retired federal judge who had specialized in housing discrimination cases during her career. What they did to your son is part of a pattern that violates federal law, she said firmly. I'm a retired federal judge who specialized in housing discrimination, and I've been documenting similar cases here for months. She shared how her husband's wheelchair ramp request was denied after his stroke, along with 3 other similar incidents involving residents with mobility issues. Deborah is systematically targeting disabled residents, Eleanor explained. I've already contacted my former colleagues at the Justice Department. Would you join our effort to stop this? I agreed immediately. The day after sending a cease and desist letter with help from a disability rights attorney, we found dog waste planted on our porch with a threatening note about eviction, another incident caught on our security camera. Our security camera had captured the entire incident, showing our neighbor, Victoria Vasquez, Deborah's close friend and fellow board member, planting the waste at 5:30 a.m. Eleanor arranged a private meeting at her home with several other affected residents. Sarah Chin's elderly mother had been denied reasonable modifications to their bathroom doorways for wheelchair access. Robert Jenkins, a decorated Marine veteran with PTSD, had faced mounting fines after his therapy dog was classified as an emotional support animal rather than a service animal, a distinction Deborah manufactured to justify different treatment. Most disturbing was the story from the Gonzalez family, whose 12-year-old daughter with autism had been banned from the community pool after a meltdown, with Deborah citing disruptive behavior policies that didn't exist in any written HOA guidelines. This isn't just mean-spirited, it's systematic civil rights violations, Eleanor explained. I've spent my career identifying patterns of discriminatory behavior, and this is textbook. We formed the Oak Ridge Accessibility Alliance, meeting weekly at different homes to avoid drawing attention. 23 residents eventually joined, many sharing similar stories of intimidation and discrimination. Martha Williams, the former Architectural Review Committee member who resigned in protest, provided damning evidence, rejected accommodation requests with Deborah's handwritten notes reading property values first, too visible from street, and most disturbingly, find reasons to deny. Our alliance developed a strategy to document everything, file complaints, and prepare legal action, unaware that Eleanor's Justice Department contacts had already set wheels in motion. FBI Civil Rights Division agent Marcus Torres was quietly investigating, posing as a home buyer at open houses while obtaining warrants to monitor HOA communications. Meanwhile, Deborah's tactics escalated dramatically. Michael was physically blocked from entering the community center with Buddy. Our car was keyed with leave scratched into the paint. Anonymous calls to animal control reported our dangerous animal. Despite video evidence of these incidents, local police, likely influenced by Sergeant Klein, dismissed everything as civil matters, with one officer suggesting we should consider if this community was the right fit for your families. Situation. During this period, Robert Jenkins made a crucial discovery through a former military contact, now working in local government. Meeting minutes from a county zoning commission revealed Deborah had attempted to sell her house the previous year, but lost a potential buyer when they expressed concern about too many visible disabled residents affecting neighborhood appeal. Her solution, rather than addressing the buyer's discriminatory attitude, was to systematically force out residents with disabilities or visible accommodations. Her elevation to HOA president provided the perfect mechanism for this plan. Our alliance shared all this information with Eleanor's Department of Justice contact. What we didn't know was that Agent Torres had already gathered substantial evidence, including HOA emails explicitly discussing ways to encourage turnover among problem residents, financial records showing HOA funds diverted to private security, specifically instructed to target certain homeowners, recordings from HOA meetings where accommodations were discussed in coded language about maintaining community standards, text messages between board members referring to disabled residents as property value reducers. The investigation had expanded beyond civil rights violations to include mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges, turning what began as a civil matter into a potential criminal case. Then came Tuesday, July 15th, the confrontation captured in our security footage that would ultimately break the case wide open. The day began ordinarily enough. Michael had his usual breakfast, scrambled eggs with toast, Buddy sitting patiently beside him, attentive to his every movement. We discussed his upcoming Braille exam, for which he felt well prepared. Around 9 a.m., Michael prepared for his daily independence exercise, a walk to the community mailbox, a route he and Buddy had practiced dozens of times. "Back in 20 minutes, Dad," he called, adjusting Buddy's harness with practiced hands. It was a warm summer morning, and Michael had decided to wear shorts, making his leg braces visible, something he had only recently become comfortable with after months of therapy. "Take your time," I replied, proud of his growing confidence. "I'll be on that work call, but my phone will be on if you need anything." I settled into my home office for a video conference, positioning my laptop so I could see the front yard through the window. This had become my habit, working near windows, keeping Michael in my sight when possible, a parent's instinct I couldn't overcome despite his increasing independence. At precisely 9:17 a.m., my phone pinged with a security alert. I glanced down to see our doorbell camera activated by motion. What I saw made my blood run cold. Through the high-definition video, I watched in real time as Officer James Klein, Deborah's brother-in-law, approached my son in full police uniform on our front walkway. Deborah was visible in the background, standing near our property line with a smug expression. Beside the officer was a metal animal crate. I immediately excused myself from the conference call and turned up the volume on my phone to hear the confrontation. "Stop right there," Officer Klein ordered, hand raised in the universal stop gesture. His voice was authoritative, commanding, the full weight of law enforcement behind it. "I'm here on official HOA business. This animal has been reported as unauthorized and needs to be removed from the property immediately." Michael, clearly disoriented by the confrontation, stopped walking and clutched his white cane tighter. "Who's there? What's happening?" "Officer Klein, County Police," he stated with authority. "I'm responding to reports of an unauthorized animal on HOA property in violation of community guidelines." "This is my guide dog," Michael protested, his voice rising with fear. "You can't take him. I need him to see. He's not just a pet." The footage clearly shows Michael's growing panic as Officer Klein produced a metal cage and began forcing Buddy inside. The dog, trained never to leave his handler, resisted at first, but eventually complied when the officer used a treat to lure him in, a disturbing detail that suggested this had been planned in advance with knowledge of service animal training. My son reached out blindly, desperately trying to locate his companion, his hands finding nothing but air. The image of my blind son reaching out, unable to see what was happening to his guide dog, is something I'll never forget. "Where's Buddy? What are you doing? I can't see. Please tell me what's happening." Michael's voice cracked as Deborah moved closer, watching the scene unfold with evident satisfaction. The security footage captures every excruciating second. My son's growing panic, his increasing disorientation as he lost contact with Buddy, the dog's confused whimpering from inside the cage. "Please," Michael begged, tears forming. "I can't see without him. I don't understand what's happening. Can someone tell me where my dog is?" I was already racing out of my office, phone in hand dialing 911 as I ran. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, emphasizing that someone was impersonating an officer and attempting to confiscate a service animal. As I burst through the front door, my security system captured what happened next in perfect clarity. I screeched into our driveway, seeing Buddy whimpering in the cage, Michael trembling with his white cane extended, feeling desperately for his companion, and Officer Klein standing between them in his official police uniform. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, positioning myself between Michael and the officer. I put my arm around my son's shoulders, feeling him trembling. "Dad!" Michael turned toward my voice, relief and fear mingling in his expression. "They took Buddy. I don't know where he is. He's in a cage, I told him quietly, then turned back to the officer. On what legal authority are you removing a federally protected service animal? I'm responding to a community ordinance violation, Officer Klein stated with cold authority. This animal has been deemed in violation of HOA guidelines. He produced an official-looking document with both police department and HOA letterheads. I have authorization to enforce HOA regulations as part of our community policing initiative. Deborah stepped forward from where she had been observing. She wore a satisfied expression that the camera captured perfectly, a smirk that would later become damning evidence. Your son has been warned repeatedly about having an unauthorized animal on community property, she stated. The board voted unanimously to remove the animal. We've documented multiple instances of aggressive behavior. That's completely false, I responded, keeping my voice steady for Michael's sake. Buddy has never shown aggression. What you're doing violates multiple federal laws protecting service animals. This is a private community, she replied with a smug smile perfectly captured by our camera. Our covenant supersedes federal regulations when it comes to safety standards. My son is blind, I emphasized, gesturing to Michael's white cane. That dog isn't a pet. He's Michael's eyes. Dad, where's Buddy? Michael asked, his voice breaking. I can hear him whimpering. Why is he making that sound? The camera captured my son's distress in heartbreaking detail, his hands clutching his cane, his unseeing eyes wide with fear, tears streaming down his face as he tried to understand what was happening around him. What Deborah didn't notice, but our security camera captured perfectly, was an unmarked sedan parked across the street, with a telephoto lens clearly visible through the windshield. The FBI surveillance team had been documenting the entire confrontation. Harold Peterson, our next-door neighbor, emerged from his house and began recording the scene on his phone. Two other neighbors stopped their cars at the curb, watching the confrontation with evident concern. A patrol sergeant arrived minutes later, responding to both my 911 call and one placed by our neighbor who witnessed the confrontation. The body camera footage, which we later obtained through legal discovery, shows the sergeant's confusion as he assessed the situation, a visibly distressed teenager with a white cane, a dog in a cage, and Officer Klein standing there in full uniform. What's going on here, Klein? The sergeant asked, looking between us with growing concern. This officer is abusing his authority to enforce HOA rules and has confiscated my blind son's guide dog, I explained quickly. The sergeant's expression darkened as he turned to Officer Klein. You're on duty? Is this official police business? Officer Klein straightened. I'm responding to a community ordinance violation. The sergeant's demeanor immediately changed. That's not what dispatch shows. You're not assigned to any calls here. He examined the HOA document in Klein's hand. Since when do we enforce private HOA regulations? Step away from the animal crate, he ordered, and we'll discuss your unauthorized use of police authority back at the station. I'm acting within my rights as an officer, Klein protested, though his confidence was clearly shaken. The officer immediately ordered Buddy released and returned to Michael, explaining firmly to Deborah that interfering with a service animal was potentially a criminal offense. This is a civil HOA matter, Deborah insisted, her voice rising. We have authority, not over federal disability protections, the sergeant interrupted firmly. Officer Klein's unauthorized actions will be addressed separately. Now step back while I return this service animal to its rightful handler. As they argued, I focused on Michael, who was on his knees embracing Buddy. The dog licked tears from my son's face, his tail wagging with relief at being reunited with his handler. Michael buried his face in Buddy's fur, his shoulders shaking with sobs, a mixture of relief and lingering fear. It's okay, Michael whispered, his voice breaking as he buried his face in Buddy's fur. I won't let them take you again. I promise. His fingers trembled as they traced the outline of Buddy's face, as if memorizing every feature through touch. In that moment, watching my blind son vowing to protect the very animal meant to protect him, something broke inside me. This wasn't just about HOA rules or property disputes. This was my boy, who'd already lost his sight, his mother, and nearly his will to live, now forced to defend the one relationship that had pulled him back from despair. The injustice of it overwhelmed me. I turned away, not wanting Michael to hear the rage and grief in my voice as I whispered, "Neither will I, son. That's a promise." That evening, as Michael finally fell asleep with Buddy protectively curled beside him, my phone rang with an unknown number. "Mr. Wilson? This is Special Agent Marcus Torres with the FBI Civil Rights Division. What happened to your home today was captured by our surveillance team. We've been monitoring your situation for the past 7 weeks. Today's events constitute multiple federal offenses, including civil rights violations and corruption. We need you to come in tomorrow." The following morning, in a federal building downtown, I was shown evidence that left me speechless. HOA emails explicitly discussing how to make life unbearable for the blind kid with the dog. Until we moved financial records showing HOA funds misappropriated for bribes to Officer Klein and other police officers' text messages revealing Deborah had instructed her brother-in-law to use his police authority to intimidate residents with disabilities footage from HOA office security cameras. Capturing board discussions about leveraging police connections to create a hostile environment for disabled residents, Agent Torres slid a final USB drive across the table. "This was recovered during our search of Officer Klein's home safe," he said quietly. "You should prepare yourself." The recording began with mundane HOA discussions, but then Deborah's voice cut through, chillingly calm. "My brother-in-law has secured police support for our community improvement plan," she explained to the board. "Phase 1 targets the Wilson boy. His blindness makes him ideal, visible enough to scare other disabled residents, but vulnerable enough to break quickly. Property values drop 15 to 20% in neighborhoods with visible disabilities. Remove the dog, and they'll move. The others will follow once they see we're serious." Then came the words that made the agent pause the recording. "I've secured buyers already, 3 investors waiting to purchase at discount once we've cleansed the community. No one wants to live next to defectives, but everyone wants a bargain property. We stand to make millions in referral fees alone." It wasn't just discrimination. It was a criminal real estate scheme. Agent Torres explained that what had begun as a civil rights investigation had expanded significantly. "We have evidence of mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy against rights, and violations of the Fair Housing Act," he explained. "Today's attempt to remove your son's service animal while impersonating law enforcement crossed into criminal territory." He revealed that similar investigations were underway in 3 other communities where Deborah had previously served on HOA boards, each showing identical patterns of discrimination. "Deborah has made a critical mistake," Agent Torres explained, showing me Klein's text messages. "She's called an emergency board meeting tonight to create falsified, backdated policies. We've set up audio surveillance, but need visual confirmation of document tampering." His expression was grim. "Would you be willing to attend as our witness? It's unusual, but given your standing in the community." Hours later, I sat silently in the back row of the community center, heart pounding beneath the small recording device taped to my chest. As Deborah called the meeting to order, Jim Takahashi's subtle nod from the board table confirmed our plan was in motion. The trap was set. Deborah distributed folders to each board member. These contain revised community guidelines regarding service animals, emotional support animals, and reasonable accommodations, she explained. The dates on these documents show they were implemented last year, before any current complaints were filed. She made no attempt to disguise her intentions. If federal investigators come asking, these policies have always been in place. Those needing special accommodations should have reviewed them before moving in. Board member Victoria Vasquez raised a tentative hand. "Isn't backdating official documents illegal?" "Only if we get caught," Deborah replied dismissively. "And who's going to tell?" "The blind kid." The laughter that followed died instantly as the conference room doors opened. Agent Torres entered, flanked by 4 additional agents. "Deborah Klein, you're under arrest for conspiracy against rights, mail fraud, wire fraud, and violations of the Fair Housing Act," he announced, displaying his badge. As agents secured the documents Deborah had just distributed, they advised all present that tampering with evidence in a federal investigation carried separate charges. The stunned silence, as board members realized they'd been caught in a federal sting operation, marked the beginning of justice we'd waited months to see. The federal indictment was extensive. 17 counts against Deborah personally, 12 against Officer Klein for civil rights violations and abuse of authority, and 4 against board members who had knowingly participated in discrimination. Most board members quickly sought cooperation agreements, providing additional evidence of discriminatory practices dating back 3 years. The police department faced a separate Justice Department investigation that led to the suspension of 4 officers and the resignation of the police chief, who had turned a blind eye to the abuse of authority. Deborah initially fought the charges, claiming she was being targeted for enforcing community standards. Her defense collapsed when prosecutors produced emails in which she explicitly discussed using HOA rules to cleanse the community of undesirables. Most damning was her own security footage, which captured her stating to Victoria Vasquez, "If we can get the disabled ones out, property values will jump. No one with options chooses to live near broken people." In a surprise move, Deborah eventually accepted a plea agreement that included 18 months in federal prison, $750,000 in fines and restitution to affected families, 500 hours of community service with disability organizations, a lifetime ban from serving on any HOA or community board nationwide. The Department of Justice expanded their investigation into 5 other communities where Deborah had previously served, uncovering similar patterns of discrimination and resulting in substantial settlements. For dozens of affected families, the repercussions within our community were immediate and profound. The day after Deborah's arrest, our neighborhood message board exploded with shocked reactions, confessions of similar experiences, and calls for change. Residents who had remained silent for months suddenly found their voices. An emergency meeting was called at the community center. The turnout was unprecedented. Over 350 homeowners packed the room, spilling out into the hallway and parking lot. For the first time in years, nearly 80% of the community was present and engaged. The acting board secretary, visibly nervous, called the meeting to order. The agenda was simple: address the federal investigation, determine interim leadership, and create a path forward. What unfolded over the next 3 hours revealed the depth of division and, ultimately, healing that our community would undergo. Several residents stood to share their experiences under Deborah's leadership. Mrs. Gonzalez described how her autistic daughter had been banned from the community pool after having a sensory meltdown. Frank Miller, a Vietnam veteran with PTSD, recounted being fined for his emotional support animal. The Johnsons detailed their struggle to get approval for a wheelchair ramp for their aging mother. One by one, residents came forward until it became clear that Deborah's discrimination hadn't been limited to a few isolated incidents. It had been a systematic campaign affecting dozens of families, with disability discrimination being her primary focus. Then something unexpected happened. Victoria Vasquez, one of the board members who had most closely aligned with Deborah, approached the microphone. Her hand shook as she held a stack of papers. "I was wrong," she began, her voice breaking. "I have here the original community guidelines from when Oak Ridge was established. Nowhere do they mention excluding accommodations or targeting residents with disabilities. Deborah convinced us these changes were necessary for property values, but they weren't. They were her personal crusade." Victoria revealed that Deborah had manipulated board minutes, selectively enforced rules, and deliberately created a hostile environment for certain residents. "I'm ashamed I didn't see it sooner," she concluded, tears streaming down her face. "Or worse, that I saw it and did nothing." By unanimous vote, the remaining board was removed, and an emergency election established new leadership under a temporary committee chaired by Eleanor Patel. What followed was nothing short of a community revolution. The first act of the new board was to formally apologize to all affected residents. They established a restitution fund to repay unjust fines and created the state's first HOA accessibility and inclusion committee with binding authority over all accommodation requests. The community center, once dominated by Deborah's preferred activities, was reimagined as a truly inclusive space. The unused storage room was converted into a sensory-friendly quiet room for residents with autism or sensory processing disorders. Ramps were installed at all entrances. The pool area received an accessibility upgrade, including a lift chair. In a powerful demonstration of community support, over 200 neighbors organized a Walk with Michael event 6 weeks after the confrontation. The route intentionally followed the path to the community mailbox, the same journey where Michael had been confronted and Buddy had been confiscated. Residents lined the sidewalks, many tearfully apologizing for remaining silent during the harassment. Michael and Buddy proudly led the procession, the Golden Retriever's service vest adorned with supportive messages written by community children. "I never imagined so many people cared," Michael told me that evening. "For the first time since losing my sight, I don't feel like I'm facing this alone." The event became an annual tradition, eventually expanding into a regional disability awareness program that has been replicated in neighboring communities. Local news coverage of the second annual walk brought attention to our community's transformation, with reporters contrasting before and after stories of inclusion. Perhaps most remarkable was the transformation of some former board members. After completing court-mandated sensitivity training, 3 became dedicated advocates for inclusive community governance. Jim Takahashi, who had privately warned me months earlier, now conducts workshops for HOA boards on recognizing and preventing discrimination. What happened in our community wasn't just about one prejudiced person, he often says in his presentations, which have now been given to over 50 HOA boards across the state. It was about what happens when good people stay silent in the face of discrimination. That silence becomes complicity. The impact extended far beyond our neighborhood. The FBI investigation ultimately revealed that our HOA was just one example of a growing trend of housing discrimination masquerading as community standards, a finding that prompted a nationwide Department of Justice initiative. Michael found his voice through this ordeal, creating a youth advocacy group for disabled teens. His first presentation to the state legislature on housing discrimination received a standing ovation and contributed to the passage of stricter state enforcement of accessibility laws. The security footage from our doorbell camera showing Michael reaching out blindly for his confiscated guide dog became a powerful image in civil rights education, featured in training materials for HOA boards across the country. Most significantly, our case prompted federal legislation strengthening enforcement mechanisms for the Fair Housing Act, with specific provisions addressing HOA compliance, legislation informally known as Buddy's Law. Yesterday marked 1 year since that confrontation on our doorstep. Michael and Buddy led the ribbon-cutting ceremony for our community's new accessibility park, built on land previously restricted to residents without assistive devices. As Michael and Buddy cut the ceremonial ribbon, flashbulbs capturing the moment for local newspapers, I noticed something extraordinary. My son wasn't just navigating with confidence, he was leading. His blindness, once used as a weapon against him, had become his strength. The hands that once reached desperately into darkness now guided others toward light. Sometimes I still wake at night, heart racing from dreams of that day on our doorstep. But then I hear Buddy's gentle breathing beside Michael's bed, a reminder that some battles change more than just laws. They change souls. The greatest victory against hatred isn't just winning in court, it's watching your wounded child stand tall again, showing others how to see what truly matters, even in darkness.